Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In this episode of Strategikon, we are joined by our regular guest, Commodore Pat Tyrrell, OBE, Royal Navy retired, Chair of the SAGE International Australia Advisory Board and SIA's Senior Non-Resident Fellow Global and Maritime Security, coming in live from Cornwall in the United Kingdom. Today, we will examine the ongoings in Belarus and the likely fate of Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. Will Putin's Russia be silent and will Putin's Russia be a silent and passive witness to unfolding events in this neighbouring country? We will then discuss changes to European security caused by the recent decision of President Trump to relocate US forces from Germany to Poland. And finally, to that other smouldering situation in Europe's southeast and the eastern Mediterranean between NATO members and longtime regional rivals Turkey and Greece. What's going on there? Joining us via Zoom in our virtual studio today is co-host David Olney. Hello, David.
Good afternoon, John, and good evening, everyone.
And our producer Tim Whiffen is on leave this evening, so I will be in the driver's seat. Oh my God. Anyway, before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategikon can be found on the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the SAGE International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. For those in our audience who would like to watch our podcast rather than listen to it, please check out our podcast on the Strategikon War YouTube channel. The August 9 presidential election in Belarus was quickly met by public outrage, with critics of Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko claiming that the results were rigged. Mass protests have taken place in the country and Lukashenko's grip on power in Minsk looks fragile. To what degree was Lukashenko a Putin puppet, Pat?
Well, he was a sort of badly behaved pet dog, really. I mean, he used to he's one of those pet dogs that never does everything you tell him to do. He messes on the carpet occasionally. I think Putin got a little tired of him from time to time. But, you know, he wasn't one of those people that Putin thought he ought to get rid of, because if you liked, he belonged to Putin. As I say, it's a bit like your pet dog. You don't want to get rid of it, even if it does misbehave.
Kind of like my cat.
Yeah, probably exactly like your cat.
Right,
John.
right. Yes.
Yes.
I had to make the tie back to an Abyssinian cat, you know, for our audience, because my cat is an Abyssinian. He's very naughty. But anyway, that being beside the point. So Lukashenko is just like my cat Lockie.
The only problem is your cat is smart.
He knows when I get out the Nerf gun that everything is okay. So basically, if Lukashenko was a badly behaved, well, dare I say, badly behaved rabid dog, maybe, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, Putin has a stake in what goes on in Belarus. So if, for instance, Lukashenko falls to a liberal clique in Minsk, what will this mean for Russia's security, Pat?
Well, I think that you've got to understand that the Russians will be looking towards they'll remember their experience in the Baltic republics, which are right next door to Belarus. And the last thing they would want is for Belarus to get rid of a president who, although he was a bad-tempered dog, was not particularly bright, but he certainly remained in Russia's orbit. If you recall, there's a defense agreements. There was an agreement that both Russia and Belarus should almost join forces and become a single entity, although that's not been moved on over the last few months. So Putin, I think, will not be in too much of a hurry to go in to support Lukashenko unless there was clear evidence that there was going to be a liberal clique in Minsk that was going to come out as top dog.
David?
I'm sort of confused with what's going to happen there, because the talk about Belarus and Russia joining seems to have been on and off for over 20 years. And it would seem that this is the closest thing Russia has to a genuine ally and friend, but it's in a very vulnerable position, being right beside the Baltic states. So it seemed to me that locking Belarus in some sort of formal union would have been a really important thing to do, and that now that opportunity seems to have been missed. I would assume there would be a lot of scrambling in Moscow going, well, what happens if we do lose control of this? In reality, the economy is a disaster. It doesn't have the energy that Russia has. It's basically a food bowl, but that's not that unique a thing in the world. I assume what we'll see is Putin helping to ensure that even if it looks democratic, that it's wide-handed and subverted as quickly as possible. And that this is going to be the real problem. The Belarusians, what are they going to do against, sort of Putin's dirty tricks capacity that's been honed to the nth degree in Ukraine? I pity the Belarusian sort of opposition having to confront Putin, who can't lose Belarus, needs to control it even more sort of extremely than parts of Russia. It just seems such a mess.
Well, I think, I would agree with that, David. Russia cannot allow Belarus just to slip quietly into a Western orbit. Russia has long considered itself to be surrounded by NATO, and Belarus, if you like, gives it its strategic defense depth. It removes the border of Russia by several hundred miles from the Baltic states, from the eastern borders of the Baltic states, by having this pliant state in there. I think that Russia has got several options, and I certainly believe that the option of doing a sort of covert operations in Belarus is probably the most likely one that we will see over the next few months. Russia is, and while I agree that Belarus's economy is much, much weaker than Russia's, Russia's economy is not in the best of states of health at the moment. And I think for Russia to have a full frontal military advance into Belarus would not be in Putin's interests quite at the moment. But he will reserve that as a sort of last backstop. But Russia's interests in Belarus are non-negotiable and existential. And we must never, ever forget that. And so, the idea that NATO might come along and say to Belarus, come and join us, is not going to be one that is going to really be a sensible one.
Look, we live in a world based on grey zone threats and hybridized warfare. And in many ways, Putin's Russia pioneered much of this sort of innovation in strategy, deeply destabilizing though it might be, in order to push back Western influence from its borders. So how likely are we to see little green men popping up all over Minsk to restabilize Belarus and keep the landlocked Eastern European country orientated toward Moscow? Is it better for Putin to have Belarus as a semi-independent buffer state, or would it be in Russia's interest to take it back and just have that territory? Because quite frankly, they've lost so much strategic depth as a country, and most of Russia's strategic paranoia is driven by the fact that NATO expansion has kept on pushing along its western frontier further and further toward Moscow. So what do you think about that?
I think that what Russia would like, ideally, is for Lukashenko to be removed, but replaced with someone who has similar sorts of views of Russia and Putin. And you would see, I think, that Russia will offer considerable assistance to Belarus if that sort of leader came up. And I would have thought at the moment that I think the little green men are undoubtedly in Belarus working away and doing some strategic planning. But I think one of the things they'll be doing is trying to get Lukashenko and his group to look at Lukashenko going into some sort of retirement and being replaced by somebody who Putin can consider to be someone worthwhile, somebody who can go out and win an election, not necessarily an unrigged election, because I don't think that could ever happen. I mean, this is the problem, of course, is that even in Russia, the elections are rigged. So you could never have a free and fair election in Belarus that would meet Western standards. But I think they would hope that they could get somebody in, things will stabilize, there will be, because otherwise Russia will be forced to consider more severe actions.
David and I have been talking a lot in terms of the defense grant work that we're currently doing about this thing called durable disorder. And I think one thing that pops up in all the reading that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks is that Russia, you're right, its economy is not very strong. And certainly the country is in no position to grab the T-72s and throw them over the border in force as a conventional foot stomping exercise, if we will. But in terms of their asymmetric policies, I mean, they could go in, they could fluff around in Belarus for as long as necessary to find that person that you were talking about, to restabilize the place. But time is really on their side. I mean, we only have to look at what they're doing in the Donbass. They kind of accept that, yeah, Ukraine is now partitioned into an area that, Russia controls quite vehemently, and those lines will not be crossed. It's a frozen conflict. Do we see any signs of Moscow driving their way all the way to Kiev? No. They're happy to have what they've got without overstretching themselves. So really, in terms of their positioning in Belarus, it could be another case of, taking the strategic high ground, fluffing around in the middle, and just knowing that there is at least enough instability to keep the West disinterested in terms of getting themselves involved in a significant way.
Well, I think another thing to add to that is that over the next 3 months, the United States is going to be totally enmeshed in its election, and a sitting president who desperately wants to have a second term, facing a reinvigorated Democratic Party who are uniting behind their contender, and they are going to be totally focused on what's going to happen in the election at the beginning of November. Mm-hmm. If there's any uncertainty about the result, which is always a possibility. I mean, we may not have hanging chads as we had 20 years ago, but we'll have, other things will happen. Then the United States is going to be in a state of major flux between now and probably next February. Mm-hmm. Also, if you couple that with a potential second wave of the coronavirus, the stage is well set for the West to be totally distracted, which is the time when I would suggest that they will be using their covert operatives as much as possible. Lukashenko has already tried to imprison and get rid of the main populists. I think you would find that there would be a wave of assassinations done by, people, scapegoats who can be easily blamed. There will be unrest. Lukashenko will then be thrown out, and suddenly this chap will come in and replace them, who actually is really just a Putin placement, in the hope that the population of Belarus will say, thank heavens somebody's come in, we can settle down, we can go back to having a peaceful time. But it would still be a subversion of any of the processes that existed in Belarus. I mean, after all, the election was a complete farce. It was badly rigged, really by a chap whose real sole claim to fame was being a manager of a tractor cooperative until 20 years ago when he became, 26 years ago when he became president.
David?
I'm a bit more concerned about the state of Russia and what that might force Putin to do in this situation. COVID is having probably a bigger impact there than a lot of places because of the age of so much of the population. You've got disruption around Vladivostok where it's becoming clear that Putin can pull a governor out, but he can't calm a population down that have no faith in Moscow. Economically, you could do the little green man in Ukraine, but you could also pour a lot of money into it. And historically, the Russians always knew that Ukraine was more or less happy to look west, or at least half the country was. Here you've got a bit of the country that's always looked to Moscow. There was always the assumption there'd be enough economic resources to buy it off, and the regime felt safe in its own skin. With winter coming in Europe, that's when the next wave of COVID will more than likely hit very hard. So I have a terrible feeling that from a regime perspective for Putin, the timetable on this will be accelerated, and there is more of a need to look tough than there has been for a long time. And he also knows that the Chinese are watching and probably laughing that this is hysterically funny from their perspective, which would be intolerable for him as he wonders, well, what am I in a circle going to do if I start looking weak? So I actually think Russia is more likely to do something dumb sooner than at any point before, simply because of all the other things that are going against the regime at the moment.
Well, all I can say about that is that, with NATO unable to move because of COVID and the lack of US leadership, and then, of course, Washington not being able to move because it's, quite frankly, disinterested in what happens in that part of Europe, but also there's COVID and the election, as Pat was saying. It's going to be interesting to see how Brussels gets on top of this. I mean, after all said and done, the Europeans have just gone through the whole Brexit thing. I think they're still reeling from that loss of Britain, but they're struggling to find a position for themselves to inhabit on the continent. Obviously, anything that starts unraveling toward the Russian border should fall under the mantra of the European Union. What is Brussels thinking about this? Do we know anything about that, Pat?
Well, I think that the Brussels ability to think strategically is extremely limited at the moment. I think that Brussels and the European Union is going through its own economic traumas, and we're going to discuss part of that when we come on to look at the issues with Greece and the Aegean. And I think that Europe would find it very difficult on its own to be able to take serious action that would have any influence on what Vladimir Putin decided to do, or indeed what Lukashenko would decide to do. I think that this is why I think that that there's a period, and I don't disagree with what David was saying. There is a period of mayhem going on at the moment, partly COVID, partly economics, partly the US election. From the UK side, we've got the end of the transition phase for Brexit coming to an end in December. We're still trying to negotiate our major deal. Are we going to go on to the World Trade Organization tariffs? How are we going to do it? So there is a lot of uncertainty going on, which gives plenty of opportunity for Russia to decide to make a complete misjudgment. And the big problem about Russia making a major misjudgment is that, the worst thing that could happen in Europe at the moment is that that Russia's economy collapses, because that is going to leave the room open for major conflict. And my big worry is not that we go into a European war for all sorts of good reasons. It's that we go into we're forced into a war of conflict because nobody can work out how to do anything else. And that's the real problem that is going to happen. And from the West side, the best thing we could hope for would be for if you like, a more independent Belarus to emerge out of this with a leader that commands the popular vote. What we do not want is a group coming out in Minsk that immediately wants to join the European Union and join NATO, because that will exacerbate the situation wildly. And I think that, Russia is, it's a nation of ambiguities anyway, and those ambiguities are now surfacing in a way that is going to tear it apart if it's not careful. David was referring to what's going on in the Far East as far as Russia's concerned. There are issues going on, in the Arctic from a strategic point of view. Although incidentally, I did see that Trump wanted to swap Puerto Rico for Greenland, which I thought was, a strategic genius stroke.
Well, you and I both know that the Danes would love to have Puerto Rico because, they like the sun.
Yes. Well, they've got so much in common with Puerto Rico.
Absolutely.
So, Viking longboat races in the Caribbean.
Yes.
Oh, dear God. Anyway, focusing on another matter entirely in Europe, President Trump, long known as a critic of NATO and often publicly berating member states for not doing enough to lift their collective defense budgets, has recently decided to move the locus of American power out of Germany and into Poland. The Poles are paying for this relocation and for the beefed up US presence on their soil. However, Poland's economy is not Germany's. And so how long can Warsaw sustain a robust Polish military and an increased American military presence in Poland? Pat?
About 3 weeks.
Well, there you go. That's the answer. 3 weeks. Yeah.
I mean, seriously, this is complete and utter nonsense. You know, it really is. I mean, it makes great headlines, but it's not going to deliver anything. It's not going to contribute to the stability of Europe. You know, the American forces and the American headquarters that are based in Germany at the moment are there for extremely good reasons. And they are not the reasons they were there for in 1945 or 1950. They are there to give American forces a stable launch pad for a crisis anywhere in this half of the globe. And you know, they have launched many operations from their German bases over the last 20 or 30 years, the wisdom of which for each one you can debate at length, but they have had a stable home base from which to develop. Yes, there is no doubt that America, and this has been a consistent view of the American administrations for really as long as I can remember. You know, this issue of burden sharing. And I think that actually it depends, you know, it's like any other business, and this should appeal to President Trump as a businessman. It's like any other business, depending upon the accountant you had, depends upon, you know, how profitable your business is. Depending upon the administration that you've got, depends upon how much resource the Germans give to the Americans in support of their troops. And, you know, I think that while the Americans are busily moving their forces into Poland, the administration wants to move the US European Command from Stuttgart into Poland. We're going to have this is more mayhem that is going to be caused. This is going to be more opportunity for us to, you know, miss the pass when the ball comes in our direction, because, you know, we're too busy setting up the new headquarters and we're too busy moving the troops and doing whatever. I think also it's another poke of the stick in the direction of the Russians. You know, the Russians are quite happy with where the Americans have their headquarters. I think most people are quite happy with where the Americans have their headquarters. I think that putting them into Poland is going to take time. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to divert them from their main focus of attention at a period of great change. And it's also going to put a stick in the eye of the Russian bear as the American headquarters move closer to Russia, which is completely unnecessary at this point in time. But, you know, there we are.
I think it's completely unnecessary, but I think an important thing is Trump always wants to be wanted. And the reality is the Poles want that closer connection because of their historical fear of what happens next. It also draws a clear line between Western Europe, you know, apparently having had all this time to come together and become more effective, and largely from the American perspective, having failed at that. But Central Europe's desire to get things done and to be a bit more willing to do things in an American way, which Americans always like people that want to be like them. So I don't think it really matters that this will cost a fortune. It doesn't matter, it causes chaos. And unfortunately, the people who are putting forward the most logical argument, this will freak Moscow out, won't be listened to because Americans love it when people want to be like them and include them, which is ridiculous for people with so much power. I think what will be more interesting over the next few weeks is to see, what does the rest of Central Europe think of this? At some level, the left in Germany must love this, to finally have a Germany that can truly be pacifist and warm and fuzzy in the way they want to be. It's not representative of the whole country, but there's going to be people in Germany, I think, who are really glad this is happening, in the same way there's people in Poland that are really glad this is going to be happening. And there could be some very interesting changes in perspective and tension between traditional Western Europe and modern Central Europe over this.
No, I don't disagree with that at all, David. I mean, I think that, there are clearly going to be people in Germany who will be delighted to see the American forces being drawn down. And for the reasons I've stated, I think that from a Europe perspective, and indeed from an American security of Europe perspective, it's not a good thing. It's not
a dumb decision, but it's the kind of decision that the dumb person in the president's seat will make.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think. I mean, I quite understand why it got made because this makes a certain president look really, really attractive in Poland.
The interesting thing about this whole notion of changing the focus of American power from Germany to Poland is that, as we had just said, it's going to take some time. So if the political polls are anything to be believed in the United States and Joe Biden wins in November, can he not simply just reverse this decision? I mean, there'll be enough people in the Pentagon who would have red flagged this as a policy prescription by Trump anyway, and would be quite happy to stay where they are in Germany. I mean, there will be political ructions with between Warsaw and Washington, no doubt, if that reversal were to come about. But nonetheless, as you say, Pat, the idea of packing up all this deeply ingrained, military edifice and then transposing it across the border into another country with, totally different methodologies and languages and so on and so forth, after having spent much of its time in Germany getting to know that country, that's going to be really chaotic. And I think it's really the lesser of two evils in many ways if Biden could reverse this decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Biden is sensible, what he'll do is he'll go ahead with the move of 6,000 or 8,000 US forces into Poland, which actually from a point of forward deployment is quite good, but your headquarters would remain in Stuttgart. I mean, that's the big problem, is when you start moving a headquarters. Because except when you're in time of conflict, when your headquarters is moving with your main bulk of your forces, you set up a main headquarters in peacetime, and there's a lot of infrastructure involved, which even with the best will in the world is going to take you a reasonable amount of time. I mean, it's not going to settle down for 2 or 3 years when you're moving this headquarters. So I think that, what a new administration might do is say, no, keep the headquarters where they are in Stuttgart, and we'll move, perhaps an air wing, or we'll move, a regiment here or a regiment there, and move them into Poland. And,
Poland's an interesting player in Europe because, of course, wedged between northern Poland and southern Lithuania is the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. And, one would think that if Trump were to see this whole process through, as chaotic as it appears to be, obviously the Russians will try to, dare I say, freak out incoming American forces by putting more Russian troops in Kaliningrad, probably more missile batteries as well, which is going to kind of destabilize Poland. Because, I mean, unlike having everything based in Germany, Poland was the buffer for the West to keep the East out. But if all of a sudden the Americans are smack bang in the middle of Poland, they're going to have to contend with the fact that you've got a potentially pro-Russian Belarus next door once that situation has been solved. And then you've got the, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad that's going to be armed to the teeth and designed to destabilize whatever it can, because of course, seeing so many American forces in relatively close proximity to Russian territory is going to raise the hackles in the Kremlin, I would imagine.
Well, it's interesting if we were having this discussion on, whatever the 1920s version of Zoom was, we would be talking about the crisis with the Danzig corridor. I mean, it has
everything old is new again.
Yes.
It's just that the ethnicity of the people in the area, under Stalin, he sent an awful lot of Russians to go and settle what is now Kaliningrad. So it's one of the realities of life, and it's a reality that NATO, for example, has certainly got used to. It is undoubtedly now extremely, it's got an awful lot of Russian weaponry in it. But it's a bit like in the Cold War. I can remember going into Berlin, into West Berlin during the Cold War, and being told about the proposed defense of West Berlin, and how the French, the Americans and the British were going to defend West Berlin. Well, in reality, the Soviet shock troops would just have surrounded West Berlin and starved it out. And that's exactly what I think would happen with Kaliningrad. You've just got to be careful of what happens with the nuclear weapons that are stored in Kaliningrad.
Yeah.
And that is, that's going to get the attention of strategists and politicians alike.
Well, turning our eyes to the next European security crisis, the competition for oil and gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically the Oryx exploration area, about halfway between Turkey and Egypt as the crow flies, is rapidly becoming another security problem for the European Union and surrounding countries. The Oryx exploration area has allegedly trillions of dollars worth of undersea fossil fuel resources and is rapidly becoming a flashpoint between Turkey on the one side, with Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt on the other. How likely are we to see major naval confrontations or a shooting war develop over ownership of this maritime space pack?
I think that the tensions that are building up there are probably the worst that we've seen since the Cyprus crisis. And if we recall the Cyprus crisis, that's remained a thorn in relations between Greece and Turkey, and has been something, the United Nations still has a peacekeeping force in Cyprus, even today, keeping the Turks in the north and the Greeks in the south apart. This was always going to happen. This was sort of inevitable once the unstitching of the Ottoman Empire, which started in the 19th century, with the Greece moving out of the Ottoman Empire, and of course all those areas where the Greeks lived, including islands that are, you know, barely offshore of Turkey. Suddenly the Aegean, of course, is a Greek sea. And so you've already built plenty of potential for tension. Then, of course, in the 1920s, as the Ottoman Empire cracked up, a bit like the Soviet Empire some 50, 60 years later, you know, one of, I think, the greatest politicians of the era, Kemal Ataturk, decided that the only way really for Turkey to exist as a successful nation and as a prosperous nation was to develop a secular nature and to embrace all the various populations that were in Turkey. And of course, that is now being unstitched. And that is not helping the Greek-Turkish relationship. You know, Turkey was admitted to NATO because it was felt that it was better to have them inside rather than having them outside. But we could really only do that while it was seen that, or while the Turks believed that their national interests lay to the West. You know, there's been a big shift over the last 30 years in which Turkey has been looking more to the east than looking to the west. And I think that we are now playing out those stages that are caused by this polarization, if you like, between Greece as a member of the EU and a member of NATO, and Turkey not being a member of the EU and looking to the east and really not worrying about its NATO membership. I mean, the fact that, you know, Erdogan decided to go and buy his SS-9s from Russia, and he was going to incorporate those into his air defense system, you know, shows that really NATO to him is not delivering what he wants, which is to become, you know, the new caliph in the Muslim world. And it's interesting because, you know, I know Sun Tzu was he's considered to be a really great philosopher. I had to bring him in at some stage. And, you know, he says the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And, you know, we look at the imam who is exiled and living in America, Gulen, as being clearly, you know, he must have some sort of democratic pedigree because he doesn't like Erdogan. Well, actually, you know, Gulen and the Gulen party, which worked very, very closely with Erdogan and Erdogan's party, is as, I mean, he's as dismissive of democracy as anybody else. And in fact, the things that have happened between Gulen and Erdogan over the last 20 years have effectively destroyed what we might refer to as Western democracy, in a sense that there is a, you know, that there's a healthy, at least two-party system that can work together, and that either side will provide a consistent government if they get elected. And So we've got this polarization here in the Aegean, and I think that the only way it's going to end is when actually fossil fuels become unnecessary. You know, when we are actually making huge strides now in I mean, if you look at the oil markets, you know, even Saudi Arabia is looking at how is it going to be able to manage in an area where oil is not king. Natural gas may take longer, but you know, as soon as there's no value under the sea, then there won't be a difficulty. But until then, there will be. And
that leaves the immediate future, because unfortunately the transition is yet to have occurred to a fossil fuel-free industry, if you will. But Pat, you know, we've spoken about Turkey privately now for quite some time, and I'd like you to explain to the audience how important is Turkey today as an international player, and how important is it to have Turkey belong to NATO? I mean, we can see it from the Turkish side, or we can see it from Erdogan's side, you know, wanting to think that, you know, anything Western orientated is of no particular use to him. But from the Western perspective, how important is Turkey for us and the security of the sort of southeastern Mediterranean?
well, I think it's very important. I mean, it has been for a number of years. Turkey, if you like, provides the conduit to the rest of the Middle East from our perspective, and it's an area where, certainly in a secular Turkey, which was essentially Muslim, but the religion was less important in the government than it is today, that provided a good transition in moving to areas where the religion was more of the politics and less of the religion, if you like. And I think that certainly from working in NATO, I found working with my Turkish counterparts incredibly satisfying. They were highly professional. They worked well with their Western counterparts, and I know that in other areas they've worked well with the other nations around, which, you know, gives that ability to be able to have in-depth conversations, understand where they're coming from. You know, and one of the big difficulties is that we're in a group of tribes at the moment. I mean, inevitably, because we live in different parts of the world, but of course, we live in a world where communication is now instant. I mean, here am I in Cornwall in the middle of the morning, and you're in Australia in the evening, and we're able to have an instantaneous conversation. And therefore, it's much more important for us to understand the perceptions of the people that we're dealing with. You know, you and I were discussing the other day that we still refer, from a European perspective, we still refer to the Far East. Well, you know, it's only the Far East because at some stage we decided that there was going to be something called the Greenwich Meridian, you know, and therefore we were going to start everything off from this particular line that goes through the Greenwich Observatory near London. But if you live in the Far East, you're not in the Far East, you're here, you're where you are. And it's important that we have that ability to be able to interact. What is happening in Turkey at the moment is that polarization is increasing. You know, I mean, there was a time when even, I mean, the Greeks and the Turks are very similar people. You know,
Don't
their
tell the Greeks
languages.
that. Don't tell the Greeks that.
No, I know. Don't tell the Greeks that, and don't tell the Turks that.
Yeah.
But they are. And if you go to Thessalonica, you know, they were a mixed population, and it was only as Greece moved away from the old Ottoman Empire that it became Greece. And it's important that we can relate to the perspectives of other people. And the problem that we have at the moment, and it's not just from a Muslim perspective, it's from the far right Christian perspective in the United States. You know, there is a view that my view of the world is the right one. And normally they add, because God has said so. You know, and I have to say that, you know, God clearly has all sorts of different and at times conflicting views of the world, which, you know, if there is a God, I don't think he would. But let's go down that route. But so it's having Turkey as part, you know, being part of and being, you know, the gateway to other parts of the world is vital from a European and a NATO perspective.
David, any thoughts on Turkey, modern Turkey's role in Europe?
A few things. I think to sort of jump into the thing of Pat's experience of dealing with the Turkish military. When you have a professional standard that is allowed to be exactly that, you get that transcendent ability where professionals from countries are more like each other at work, you know, than they are their own country. I think what we might be seeing in Turkey is what we saw in Pakistan in the 70s, the transition from a professional Pakistani military to sort of an Islamic military and now an Islamic professional military. So you get a gradual change there that in the end means you stop having professionalism in common because the cultural stuff gets in the way. And we really, really need energy to lose its significance, you know, as in fossil fuel energy, real quick, seeing so many countries are on the path of diluting international professionalism with historical cultural perspectives. And I suppose just the other thing to add is, you know, all the times we sit and talk, you know, about James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu. Really what we're seeing in Turkey is they've never managed to create inclusive institutions and effective rule of law. No matter what happens, extractive institutions remain normal, and enough of the population are always losing out and can see they're losing out. So populism, yeah, and populism based on historical cultural perspectives is always an easy sell to the population.
Yeah. Then of course, there's also the other aspect as well. And I was having this discussion with a friend of mine the other day about Turkey, funnily enough, and talking about NATO and its expansion into the sort of Middle Eastern domain. By having brought Turkey into the tent, by having done this, you are effectively making Turkey's internal and border problems your problem as well. I mean, we've seen now how the Turks are intervening and interfering within the Syrian battle space. We've seen them go after Kurds in Iraq. It makes for a very strange bedfellow when you have this entity, Turkey, whether secular or religiously based, doing things that are not congruent with NATO standards and the strategic culture of Western states. You know, we have an expectation that we do not oppress minorities, whereas in Turkey, they take a different view. You have a sizable minority. it needs to be stomped on because there is a likelihood of terrorism, there's a likelihood of further radicalization, and also there's the cross-border issue as well. So really, the question now is, do we just cut and let Turkey go and find whatever role it wants for itself, because it's too much for us to deal with?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that, I accept that, we've had these issues. I mean, there's, we've yet in a number of countries, including Turkey, to come to terms with actions that occurred in the First World War, which, if you like, led to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that, we're now looking in America, Black Lives Matter. We're looking at, history of slavery. We've got a number of statues being pulled down here because, they may or may not have been slavers. It's important that societies come to terms with where they've come from before they can really be comfortable in the skin they are in at the moment. I'm not saying we should actually spend too much time. I don't think we should go and necessarily, apologize and recompense those who feel they've been damaged, because actually a lot of time has passed. But I think we can, sit and acknowledge where there were atrocities, for example, so for the British in India, there were a number of atrocities that were conducted. And we need to be quite open that they were conducted, and they were things that shouldn't have happened then, and certainly would not happen now. And, we express regret for the fact that they happened. But what we shouldn't be doing is breaking up organizations because, so for example, Turkey is becoming too much of a focusing on its Islamic roots and whatever, and therefore, gosh, we don't like that, because otherwise NATO just becomes essentially a white Anglo-Saxon Christian military grouping, and you don't want that.
No.
You want to be able to say, if we are going to preserve the world, the Europe that we have, we need to have allies, and those allies might be Turkey, they're America, they're important to do.
It takes two to tango, Pat. And at the moment, Erdogan doesn't want to dance with us. He's made it.
But Erdogan is not going to last forever. And in fact, I have to say that, at the moment, Turkey, and it's worrying, the Turkish economy is collapsing. Turkey could go to the IMF, but I think Erdogan doesn't want to go to the IMF because he'd actually have to put in certain reforms that he is reluctant to do. I have a lot of faith in the resilience of the Turkish population. I think if you look at what happened in Istanbul, where the Erdogan's party lost the mayoralty of Istanbul, and then said, "Oh well, that must have been an error. We'll run the election again," and actually, the opposition candidate won again handsomely. So there is still a very healthy opposition, which will, I hope, be able to form itself into an effective governing party which can put its case at a free and fair election. Now, you might say I'm, dreaming of fairies, but I don't think what we can't do is just say, right, well, we're going to cut them loose because, we think they're on a slippery pathway to wherever. And actually, because then all that does is preserves that view, and it's very difficult to bring them together again.
I would go and say one thing about this, and that is that so long as the West appears weak, enfeebled, divided, and incapable of moving forward, the attractor for someone like Erdogan will always be the other strongman. And of course, that's why he's leaning toward Russia. And in the period of time while NATO tries to sort itself out, what it will be in the next, 5 to 10 years, how it's going to be structured, what are the main threats to Western Europe and all that kind of thing. There's enough space for Russia to get closer, maybe not as an ally of Turkey, because traditionally Russia and Turkey have been enemies more so than allies, but in terms of just finding another wedge to drive between Ankara and the West, right? And once that damage is done, it's going to be very difficult to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, would it not?
I'm going to side with Pat here and say, actually, things should get better because the Turks are such a young population, and there's two young populations. There's a highly educated cosmopolitan population, large numbers of which have voted for the opposition in Istanbul, and there's young people who've lost their jobs in Anatolia in the factories now that Europeans are buying less stuff from them. So it depends which young group win when they become, the age group that run the country.
Yeah. Well, look, if we just quickly tidy this section on Turkey up, I'm curious as to France's reaction by putting its boots on the ground, or at least in the water, saying that it will be supporting Greece in the standoff in the Eastern Mediterranean. This obviously is a sign of escalation. Paris looking for trouble to stir up close by its interests in Lebanon, or do they have a clear and present stake in what's going on in terms of the resource exploitation in that region?
I think that France is at the moment trying to carve itself out a position in the European Union where it is seen as almost the natural leader. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute, that must be Germany. But as David was saying earlier on, Germany is, by its very nature, more of a pacifist country as a result of its history. And therefore, France, particularly with the departure of Britain, France is left as the most powerful military within the European Union. And France certainly wants to be seen from that point of view as leading the way in preserving the European Union and its members. And therefore it will become natural for France to feel that it has to support Greece against Turkey, even though, of course, they're all members of NATO. I mean, this is the confusing thing about having all these different organizations that have different memberships, because you will end up with this thing whereby there is internecine warfare, if you like, going on in NATO. But that, of course, hopefully means that the NATO headquarters has an important role to play in bringing all the parties together. And it's in nobody's interest. It's not in Turkey's interest. They are economically weak. It's certainly not in Greece's interest, because they're economically weak, to enter into a sort of argy-bargy in the Aegean.
David, any final comments on this?
The thing that popped into my head while Pat was talking is, hang on, how does France feel about NATO headquarters moving to Poland? Based on the fact that, the French do a lot of training there with the Poles and sort of seem to be happy to support Polish paranoia, I wonder if France is going, well, if we can move NATO headquarters to Poland, where we'll have more influence, it makes us look even more like the military leaders. So that in some ways taking a stand on Greece immediately is more about saying we are going to be the obvious military leader, and we are going to make sure that Germany might be economically powerful, but in all other meaningful respects, if you want action, look towards France.
Interesting point.
Well, President Napoleon is doing really quite well at the moment.
Yes.
Except in the opinion polls in France.
Seems like things are moving fast in old Europe, so let's just keep an eye on that one and see how it all works out. Well, everyone, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us today, Pat, and for sharing your insights on Strategikon.
That's a pleasure.
No worries. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video on the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategikon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategikon listeners satisfied, like this cap and this t-shirt. It's good gear. Buy it. Anyway, until next time, goodbye.